What's the first thing you reach for if you're thirsty? Some nice fresh water? Pint of beer? Or a cup of tea? What do you do if said water is unfiltered, dirty, and smells a little, and likely came from the same river your sewage was being flushed into? Welcome to Chit Chat History, and today we'll be talking about the killer refreshment choices of the 18th, 19th centuries. So, what would you pick? Now, people of the past were smart, and they would know not to drink something that didn't look good. And not only that, with natural understanding, they actually knew that polluted water could be bad for you. An 1854 experiment by Dr. John Snow, no, not that John Snow, that's the one, discovered the connection to water sources and outbreaks of cholera in London. The water that had been exposed to pollution and sewage systems and being pumped into one district had a much higher death rate during the cholera outbreak than the other sewage company, who had actually recently moved their supply to a freshwater site. John Snow basically proved that water could become contaminated and cause illness. So despite the fact that they didn't know exactly why water was bad, as germ theory was only finally accepted in the 1880s, they began to learn that the water wasn't exactly safe to drink. If you found a fresh stream or lived somewhere in the country, water was perfectly fine to drink, and for the most part, they were fine through the Middle Ages and the medieval Renaissance. But problems with water only started arising when the population began to rise, and the water was more easily polluted. This began mainly in the Tudor age, when people started literally living on top of each other, and importantly, had nowhere to put their waste. And not only did water become less accessible, but just as John Snow discovered, it depends where the water came from and what it might have interacted with. Namely, sewage was the main issue, and I'll just let you connect the dots there. Another issue, as industry took off, was that material pollution such as tanneries, slaughterhouses and general waste were all setting up shops very close to canal systems and waterways. Predominantly, especially in town centres and high populated areas, water was used mostly just for washing clothes, cooking with or brewing beer. In New York City in 1748, the well water became so bad that people would buy water taken from outside of the city from fresher, deeper wells. This was called tea water, and truly was the bottled spring water of its day. So if bad water was proved a deadly killer and is off the table, the next clear option became alcohol. And they didn't know as much as we do in 2020, but alcohol is a disinfectant. So unless you drank way too much alcohol, it usually wouldn't cause any serious illnesses like the untreated water can. And they didn't exactly know why, but adding a little alcohol to water made it last longer. And this proved extremely helpful during the age of global exploration in the 17th century, when the Navy invented this water with a little rum in it, or what they called grog. With the water to rum ratio of 4:1, this diluted the effects of the rum and made the water taste better and last longer. Beer was also not the same beer that we're drinking today. It was very unstandardized, not consistent with any sort of brands, but brewed on a very local scale. Small beer, as it was known, was very low alcohol percentage, so it would not get people drunk unless they had quite a lot of it. Because of this, it was drunk by all ages at any time of the day, so giving beer to your children was just like giving them a juice box today. Beer was also more nutritious and calorie-dense for the poor, who needed refreshment and energy. So it provided these calories for many poor working classes and was often the drink of choice, even if water was deemed acceptable. In the early 1700s, gin production took off in England. The government promoted this to use up all of the surplus grain that they had. Cheap gin was readily available and a lot of the urban poor would enjoy it as much as possible every single day. Now, as production increased, people started getting better at making it, and eventually the alcohol percentage in these drinks got higher and higher, until we have what we would think of today as beer. People already hooked on this beverage as sustenance and nourishment began to get addicted easily. It was when things got really bad in 1736, after this gin epidemic, that they began discouraging drunkenness and taxing the gin itself to discourage the poor from drinking it so much. And eventually this high consumption began to decline, but still alcohol remained a staple in everyday life. The British Navy had an alcohol ration of 1 gallon, or 8 pints, every day during the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, particularly because they couldn't rely on water sources, but also because they knew that the soldiers were now mildly addicted to the stuff. But as the alcohol became itself another killer, people began turning to another beverage, tea. Again, they didn't know it, but the process of boiling water would purify it and clear away any germs. But that is essentially what tea is made of, some boiling and germ-free water with some leaves to add to the taste. Now, water itself was accessible through public wells and eventually plumbing. All you had to do was pop it over the fire for some time, or make your servants do that for you. The tea leaves themselves were quite expensive, however. We see tea spread across the world through global trading routes of the 16th century, and for a while it was hard to come by, so they were really reserved for people who had the wealth to source this new beverage. If you were part of the working classes looking for a beverage, tea really wasn't a great option for a long time, and it didn't really offer many calories, so you didn't really have the time to wait around for water to boil, and would much rather get a cheap pint at the pub. These leaves became popular amongst all classes once supply caught up with the demand, and eventually became England's lifeblood, being drunk on a daily basis, even today. Back to the original question, between beer and tea or potentially poisonous water, what would you choose? In London, it was actually something called the Great Stink that prompted them to do something about the sewage issue. This was in 1858, when the summer heat was so hot, the smell of human waste in the Thames River became a serious concern. Parliament passed a bill on the 2nd of August 1858 to create a new sewage system for London. The work was completed in the mid-1870s and finally dealt with the sewage in the city, protecting the drinking water from the pollution. Eventually, water sanitation became perfected, and we can mostly trust what's coming out of our taps nowadays. But we should all try to be grateful for all the options we have today and the knowledge we have about how germs and disease spread. Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.